Hello everybody, this is Anshul. I hope you know who I am. I am one of your fellow AP Gov students. As you know, we've finished the test. Yay, awesome. But we're going to move on. Finals coming up, and the one thing I haven't covered yet so far is foreign policy. Um, it's widely held that foreign policy and international relations is the most difficult concept when it comes to government and politics in general around the world. So I thought that why not give you guys a helping hand? I studied international relations and politics and government for about 3.5 years now. I do stuff in the field. I've been active. I believe I'm pretty good at AP government, so I thought, let's take a crack at this. The way it's going to work is very simple. Um, I'm going to go through the chapter, summarize things that I think are important, and things that I think could prove difficult. We're going to go through the sections. I want to say a disclaimer: I do not condone not reading the chapter. This is a supplement guide. You should read the chapter first and then watch the lecture. Because only if you read the chapter, will you get the lecture. Yeah. So please don't go tell your teachers. Anshul made a video saying we don't need to made a video for chapter 18, so we don't need to read the chapter. No, I did not say that. Instead, you need to absolutely read the chapter so I don't get in trouble. All right, cool. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to be going into is exactly what is U.S. foreign policy and where does it come from. So a definition for foreign policy itself is basically how a nation, just like any other policy situation, addresses conflicts or issues that arise in the international community. As you all know, there are about 196 nations in the world that are recognized by the United Nations, 193 that are part of the United Nations, and we are only one out of those nations. We are indeed very powerful as the United States. We have a lot of influence, but we still have to listen and obey to the rest of the nation. So the U.S. foreign policy is run by the U.S. State Department. The Department of State is one of the original departments of the U.S. federal government. Its first secretary was Thomas Jefferson. Its current secretary is John Kerry. Cool guy. Also, I highly recommend that anybody who's interested in foreign policy visit the State Department website and talk to me more if they want a little more. All right, cool. So, foreign policy, that's foreign policy. Defense policy is a bit more different. Defense policy is obviously regarding the military and the armed forces. So that is run by the Department of Defense. However, it's also worked on in part by other organizations. Department of Homeland Security is a big part of that. The Department of Justice, working with the FBI, is a big part of the Department of Defense in terms of just making sure that people are protected at home. There's economic defense that we need to do. The Department of Energy works very heavily when it comes to nuclear technology. They regulate a lot of that and work with the IAEA, the National Atomic Energy Administration. So defense gets very complicated. There's a lot of different actors that operate in defense, but state, I would say, is very simple. You have the Department of State that mainly operates, and then out of the White House, you have the president's advisors who advise the State Department and give them orders on what they want to see executed. Yeah, that's the way it goes. So just like any other policy we've learned about, there's a 5-step process. First thing is, of course, doing agenda setting, figuring out what you want to do. And that's very important because foreign policy, key idea is to know what you're going to do because situations are very drastic. They change very fast. So just for example, if we're doing education policy, the chance of a crisis occurring is not very high. Education is not something that's randomly plummet or it's like a massive disaster that destroys education. But foreign policy, that's very possible because these things are driven off of human emotions, off of human psyche. And human psyche, as we all know, is a very fickle and distressful thing. So it's important to be careful when we're considering that. Okay. So, isolationism was in the early republic. So effectively, after we've won the Revolutionary War, President George Washington has the idea that we need to be a more isolationist nation. The United States was just starting out. We barely won the war against Britain. We didn't want to get entangled in the conflicts that are happening on the other side of the world in Europe. So he created this idea of isolationism in his farewell address, which we all, we read. It's this doctrine that the U.S. should stay isolated from international affairs. We should stay on our side of the continent, not this world, not go to Europe, not try to get involved in the war. If you guys know the story of Hamilton, and that was okay for a little bit of time, but it didn't always guarantee that things would go the way we wanted it to, because the United States, like I said before, is not the only nation on the earth. Other things come into play that then affect how the United States is going to move forward with international politics. For example, we fought a war with in 1790 with France because France was seizing U.S. ships and basically they were taking our soldiers and impressing them as a thing against the British, trying to repress British trade. We also fought like the Barbary Wars against North African Barbary states. That was, I believe, under President. I want to say we attacked like Tripoli, and alongside the British, we basically did, like this massive like pirate raid to try to take them out because they were taking our soldiers. So like I said, international relations are very crisis oriented. Things happen, we need to address. That's proportional response. However, there was also a conflict that came directly to our shores. In 1812, the British decided, like, hey, you know what? I'm done with the Americans having their own independence, and the king sent his army straight to us. Starting off in Canada, Canadian influence reached southward, and we started providing a war on the streets, where actually the entire White House was burned down during James Madison's term. So that was an international conflict that we did not want coming. We did not want to fight the British, but the British brought it upon themselves when they invaded our nation. And one of the fundamental rules of defense and the fundamental rules of sovereignty is that, or there's two fundamental rules of sovereignty. First, that every nation has borders. And the second idea is that every nation can only be a nation if it's able to exert influence over its borders. So when we get invaded at our borders, it's important to repel the effect, and that is fair under international law when it comes to fighting, but it doesn't matter. So yeah, that was the War of 1812, right? That was a thing that we didn't really have much control over. On Monroe, our fifth president, he was like, this is getting out of hand. We don't want to get involved in European influence, so we want the Europeans getting involved in us. So he released something called the Monroe Doctrine, actually written by John Quincy Adams, where he stated that the West is going to be governed by the United States, and then the East is going to be taken care of by the rest of the world. So they can do whatever they want over there. We won't interfere, but you can't interfere here either. So it kind of said this like idea of a separation of areas, which kind of tried to kind of stay with isolationist policy of Washington, but it also opened the door to maybe exerting influence more to our Latin American and South American neighbors. So the United States, as we all know, went through under an incredible industrial revolution. We really got a lot of just insane amounts of profit and influence that slowly gained as we built up our economy under these isolationist principles. The American system of trade, and what this basically did is that they wanted to make sure that American industry was protected instead of in foreign industry. So they made a tariff on like imports, so make sure that people wouldn't be and companies would not be incentivized to actually come to America and sell their goods here. Instead, we should be selling to the rest of the world because, as you know, from mercantilism, an export-based economy is incredibly powerful. And then, of course, during the 19th century, we had one of our more depressing areas. We had the area of Manifest Destiny, where people were like, we sent Lewis and Clark off, and we found like this amazing place called the Louisiana Purchase. We took that over. We kept moving westward. There was a whole issue with slavery. And this kind of idea is where we first started to get active international relations conflicts that we actively pushed against. For example, technically the Native American tribes of the United States are considered separate entities and separate nations. We do not infringe on their rights. So technically we went to war against the Native American tribes. While we consider them like in America, they are technically their own separate nation, just not recognized by the rest of the international community. So Manifest Destiny was kind of like a big increase in like the international relations situation, and we kind of started to become more and more imperialistic as this came on. It kind of showed more of a idea that we're not willing to simply stay within our area on the east. We want to move westward. This also led to the wars in Mexico, where the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and all this stuff. Yeah, so we're going into the Roosevelt Carrier. So he basically pushed the idea that we're controlling the West so that we actually control the West. So that not only will you stay out of the West, but we will be the ones to assert influence. We will be the regional hegemon, which means like a group that contains influence in the region. So with that, we started getting into more active with the Dominican Republic. We got involved with other nations such as Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, Panama, Mexico. The book talks all about that. You can look into that more and more. We started created the Panama Canal. So there was like a lot of stuff there. And then after this, we had the Spanish-American War, which was fought between U.S. and Spain. You remember from APUSH or U.S. history, if you took it, that resulted in us getting a lot of Spanish colonies, which was weird. But we got access to like the Philippines, we got access to Puerto Rico, and Cuba. So that gave us like more in control, and especially the Philippines, because that opened us to Asian markets, which was kind of weird. Yeah. The Philippines then gave us access to Asian markets, and we started getting worried about them because that became a key value point. And as affairs in Asia began to change, the U.S. got more and more worried as we all know, China got less and less powerful. They were decreasing their influence, and then the Japanese empire was becoming very, very, very ambitious. And that's when we started getting more and more worried about the future of this region. And then, of course, as the European powers were studying the influence in China, we issued open door notes, basically saying them that they shouldn't discriminate against our investors and other spheres of influence because this is important for us to keep our assets at bay and our interests in the door. So we kind of, the idea of this was kind of weird. So we basically wanted them to open up our areas of influence to investment, right? So we could actually like invest in a place and get profits and like make value, but we also wanted to make sure that they didn't criticize and like not criticize, but like they didn't like harm our interests as well. So it was a bit of asking for a bit too much in my opinion, but they managed to get it done because of the U.S.'s powerful action. And then as this like China issue became more and more, Teddy Roosevelt, he tried to kind of control Japan a little bit through like some small agreements, but that really didn't go very well because if you look at it, the Taft-Kasuri Agreement in 1945, that one gave Japan Korea, which was pretty terrible because, you know, we know what happened to Korea after the fall of the Japanese Empire, and that was only to give American control of the Philippines and Hawaii. So the U.S. acted without the isolationist proposal at this time, but we still were focused very heavily on our own personal interests because it's American first identity than just like a national like global policy identity. And then of course World War One broke out, and Woodrow Wilson, amazing person. He wanted to keep us as neutral as possible in the war, but then when the Lusitania, as we all know, was hit by U-boats of the Germans, he basically said that we got to go to war. It was important to protect our interests, so we went to war for the first time after many years. Okay, moving on. So yeah, World War One. That's when we first started to get into the idea of global security. We realized that the German influence was not only just a nationalistic one that could cause detriment to Europe, but could also affect our interests. And that's when Woodrow Wilson took an unprecedented step. He argued that in order for the United States and the rest of the world to have security, it was important to pool together the sovereignty of these nations that are incredibly powerful to prevent conflicts going forward. It was an unprecedented, like, there were always alliances that existed from, like, imperial times, but, like, this kind of global alliance to then prosecute other nations in the name of, like, global peace was a very, very novel idea. As we all know, the League of Nations actually failed, specifically because radical Republicans who were still very heavily isolationist, they weren't adapting to the fact that, the world was changing and that globalization was happening after the Industrial Revolution. Woodrow Wilson was actually the forward thinker, but because Woodrow Wilson's Senate did not confirm his treaty, the U.S. couldn't join as required by Constitution, which meant that a lot of the power, a lot of the influence that existed, because as you look through like international relations, the U.S. is widely seen as someone who's able to bring together organizations. For example, if you look at the recent COP21 climate talks, the only reason that we had countries like India and China, heavy pollution producers, the only reason they actually signed on to the contract was because the United States signed on to the contract. So the U.S. has always been like a symbol of like bringing countries together to create like global agreements. So when the U.S. did not support the League of Nations, other nations also didn't support it as strongly, and also lost a lot of its teething power because a very large economic power was no longer part of it. And the League of Nations did try to do a few stuff, and I can go into that later on with you if you want to. You can message me on Facebook and stuff. So they did still try to like do some level of limitation. The book talks about in 1921 there was a Washington Conference which created like a little bit of an idea to like decrease arms, but that was not very effective. All it did was decrease the size of the Navy, which, as we know, did not prevent Japan at all from moving forward with World War II. We also saw the Kellogg-Briand Pact in international relations. This was like the laughingstock of the community. Effectively, everybody got together. It was like, "Yo, we're gonna like not fight each other until like something happens." So that didn't like live at all. But yeah, that's kind of like where we're going. So we're gonna go into like 16.2, the United States as a world power. So World War II is kind of like where the U.S. starts putting its actual foot on the stage, because right when World War II is breaking out, the U.S. immediately gets involved instead of waiting until the last year, as we did in World War I, until our direct interests were threatened. Because we had the idea now of collective security, where if the U.S. if there's a conflict going abroad, we believe that that's going to be endangering our markets abroad and our interests abroad. So that automatically requires the U.S. Intervention, especially when we were attacked by the Japanese during Pearl Harbor. Right at the beginning of the war, we were immediately drawn into the theater, and that basically got us into World War II. We were one of the big forces fighting. We pretty much single-handedly fought the Pacific Theater. Let's take a little bit of help from the Russians, and we absolutely sent tons of men to go die on the beaches of Normandy and inside France. We were incredibly important in helping with the supplies of the Allied effort. We helped in the liberation of the death camps in Germany. So the United States heavily set itself as we are the ultimate power here, and then when we finally dropped the bomb, that was, I think, what established, if you ask somebody in international relations, the number one thing that probably established the U.S. as a foreign policy superpower is when we dropped the bomb. When the United States decided to drop a nuclear bomb, the most powerful weapon ever created to date, that kind of just sealed the deal. Everyone was so scared of us because we had that potential to completely annihilate them. And that basically meant that we were now the controlling power. And the U.S., being hypocritical as always is, was okay, cool. We dropped the bomb. We don't want to make any more bombs. So our thing is we want to stop nuclear proliferation. And that was where the United Nations was called together. So actually in San Francisco, this is so cool. President Truman came to San Francisco, the city, where we all live. And they created the United Nations here as an organization to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And they also added the International Charter for Human Rights, which says, these are the human rights which the UN will also protect. As part of a way to politically maneuver this incredibly well, they offered the winners of World War II. So people who got together just to fight the Nazis, but they weren't necessarily friends, like the Soviets, for example, they offered every winner of World War II a seat on the UN Security Council as a permanent seat. So I should probably go on the UN Security Council a little bit, but so that was Russia, which fought with us on the Eastern Front. France, which was taken over. I don't really know if they won, but they were part of the Allies, and they were taken over as Vichy France by the Germans. The UK, the London Blitz. The UK had a huge role. China. They basically got destroyed by Japan, but technically they were still on our side, so they got a seat, and they were a growing economic power. And of course the United States. So these five organizations together created something called the UN Security Council. And then the UN Security Council, I should explain what it is. So the UN derives all power from any US organization from two sources. First, all organizations derive power from the United Nations General Assembly, which is the idea that all the nations of the world come together to recognize the sovereignty pooling of the world. And the second idea is the UN Security Council, where these five nations, because of their active power and their ability to actually execute policy, that's where they gain a lot of power as well, because they're just massive economic centers. So those are the two sources of the UN Security Council's power. And what happens now is that you have 50 members of the UN Security Council. There are 5 permanent ones, as I already mentioned, and there are 10 rotating ones that are elected every 2 years, I think. And if you look on the UN website, you can figure out who else is on the committee. But generally, it's done by regions. The UN splits the world into 7 or 8 different regions, and then it basically says, all right, we need a delegate from here, and a delegate from here, to basically represent the whole world as a whole. So yeah, we created the whole UN Security Council, and that hugely increased our potential. Then after the UN Security Council, there was a Bretton Woods system, which was created in New Hampshire, interestingly enough, and that was created the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which is kind of not the reserve, but it's a international financier of loans to countries and economic it calculates economic stability and that kind of stuff. It's a bunch of economists who come together at the world. They're actually located in DC, actually a block away from GW, by the way. So you guys are in GW. There you go. Go visit the IMF. And they also created the World Bank, which is kind of the IMF's investment bank idea. So they'd help countries that were suffering by giving them loans, and then countries could pay back on those loans. However, the World Bank has not had a great track record of that, especially recently with Zimbabwe. But they are working on reform and stuff. But you do what you can. And then you have the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs. This no longer exists. It was actually replaced with the World Trade Organization by the United Nations. But the idea was, kind of push this free trade idea, because everyone's realizing globalization is going to happen, and if everyone's going to have a stake, we're going to have free trade. See, also, I know I'm sounding like political, but this is not. This is what's agreed by generally all, um, most or all foreign policy experts. So, like, while this stuff may sound like, in terms of like the current election, like political, it could just be that the current political climate is just not listening to the foreign policy establishment. And then, of course, the Cold War is kind of like the moment when we completely take over as a hegemony. Our wartime economy booms. Um, After the Great Depression, we're increasing at a massive rate. We're getting a huge amount of influence, and at the same time, the Soviets have carried out the Bolshevik Revolution, and they're getting a massive amount of influence, and we're having this kind of like proxy situation that come up, and that's when we read about like Agent X, and APUSH, and the idea that we need to have containment in order to prevent communism, like this crazy idea for spreading to destroy our capitalist viewpoint. And then of course, as the nation became very powerful, they developed the power to destroy themselves with nuclear weapons. The UN has to be incredibly powerful at restricting nuclear weapon use in terms of like non-Security Council nations, but the Security Council, all 5 members of the Security Council have nuclear weapons. China has a few. France has a good amount. UK has a decent amount. US has like 7,000 plus. Russia has like 9,000 plus. So all of them have nuclear capability. And that was interesting. So whether that creates like returns, because let's say this, like you always see like the situation like the Mexican standoff where like one guy's got a gun, the other guy's got a gun, they're aiming at the gun at each other. They're like, oh, which one of us shoots first, and the other one shoots next, and they both die. Right? I think it's done. Same with nuclear weapons. Like a nuclear weapon could just like decimate an entire country. Like we could drop a nuclear weapon right on North Korea and just like wipe out the entire nation. So when you have that much power, basically people created a massive stockpile of nuclear weapons, and they said, okay, in the event that the United States is attacked by a nuclear weapon, we'll basically be like, screw it, we're going down anyways, why not take down our enemies with us? So then we're going to launch. So that's like what happens. Like if the President of the United States, Trump, ever gets a call saying, Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, which is responsible for this tracking, they found traces of uranium in the sky above Moscow. They believe that an imminent attack is on its way from Russian airspace to the United States. Literally, the president will have the decision to make right now. Do I want to destroy the entire United nation of Russia? And the idea is that if both nations are able to destroy each other, neither will, because nothing gets done. Nations are kind of just rip. So there's not much value there that comes from it. And that was kind of, and then also we saw with the proxy wars, there was the Korean War, the Vietnam War, there was a conflict in Cambodia, the conflict in Africa. There was many, many proxy wars where basically the nations of the world have to decide, do I want to work for the United States or do I want to work for the communists? And that's basically whenever we thought that communism was becoming too widespread, we'd send U.S. forces and then do containment and then fight a war, either win or lose. So yeah, the Cold War in Europe, basically the U.S. was with its European allies, France and the UK, and at this point now also Germany, whereas Russia was building up the Warsaw Pact, and with like Poland and other nations in the region, like Poland, for example, was like part of the Warsaw Pact. So the idea was that we're seeing like this collective security idea come together again. So the European nations are like, okay, we're Europe, we need to defend the European identity from the communists, so we're going to create the NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was a collective security pact between U.S., Canada, and then Europe to basically defend the European identity against Russian aggression. That is the ultimate goal of NATO. There's a lot of other goals, but the idea is to stop Russian aggression from destroying Europe. End story. Russia is like, that's not cool, so we're going to build our own thing called the Warsaw Pact, which then later led to the Greater Soviet Union. And then you have basically what we call, the famous Iron Curtain, that, one side is the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, the other side is NATO, and there's like this Iron Curtain that we cannot go by. Of course, then Berlin, which is like on the very border, it gets split in two with like East Berlin, West Berlin, East Germany, and West Germany. And there's a whole bunch of stuff there. So part of that is then the U.S. becomes more of it starts realizing the idea of like, okay, we need to protect U.S. interests more in terms of like our allies. So it creates a Marshall Plan to go and help Western Germany during the Western Berlin during the blockade and make sure that its people were protected by the Marshall Plan, where basically flew in like a ton of like not ships, what do you call them, planes, into Western Europe to help aid them after World War II and during the Cold War, and make sure that they wouldn't be attacked by the Soviets. Cold War in Latin America, we all read about in sophomore year. Trujillo, who was the dictator of the Dominican Republic, and we read about the revolution that happened there. The U.S. funded these dictatorships, not communist, because they wanted to refuse, like, stop communism was the essential idea. That's why we were so hard on Cuba. Also, there was the issue of the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is a very important situation. President John F. Kennedy was now in power, and what happened is that the U.S. and the Soviet Union basically had a nuclear confrontation. It was the closest we ever got to nuclear war. The doomsday clock, I think, was at like 0.1 minute or something. Like, we're all gonna die. It was pretty close because the U.S. had basically had missiles, like Titan missiles stationed, a nuclear missile stationed like Turkey as like a deterrent force against Russia, and Russia had put them in Cuba, which is like, Cuba, Florida. Like, think about it, like, we're dead. So there was like a huge like negotiation. Kennedy did some insane diplomacy that's like unheard of, and he was able to stop the Cuban Missile Crisis and keep both nations intact. And he basically put a massive blockade on the Cubans to basically force them to remove the Soviet missiles from Cuba. And I'm not going to go into Vietnam. We all know what happened in Vietnam. And then we have human rights. This is where the U.S. really changes its goal from like protecting against like fascism and stuff to protecting like just general humanity. So when Nixon became president in 1961, he said it was time to basically rework with the Soviet Union. Like, you know how we talked about the Russian reset? This is basically the Soviet Union idea of the Russian reset. So basically, want to like improve relationships with the Soviet Union, but after the Cold War. But that didn't really go too far. It was okay, but in reality, the Soviet Union kind of like still kept doing what they kept doing. They kept fighting until 1991 when Gorbachev basically just like brought down the Soviet Union single-handedly. What a god. So part of that is that they represented China first. There's a huge debate that's coming out. Actually, the Prospect is going to be releasing an article tomorrow. I think tomorrow. Yeah, talking about like the PROC and the ROC. Basically, the U.S. recognized the nationalist capitalist government that fled to Taiwan during World War II, whereas the Russians recognized the communist government in like mainland China. And to basically repair Soviet relations, we basically acknowledge that the U.S. is going to work only with mainland China, the communists, instead of the nationalists who are Taiwan. And as we know, that it's very, 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 very complicated. We also try to like do a lot of strategic arms limitation treaties. We like try to lower plutonium rates, try to decrease the amount of weapons, and these are still inactive. Actually, Putin just recently walked out of one of our key plutonium decrease agreements, which is low-key worrying for the rest of the international community, but we'll see how that goes. The only issue is that the Soviet Union and America couldn't figure out a way to like not take sides in the war. So like obviously what it says here. It says, the greatest failure of Detente, however, was the inability to establish agreed-upon rules to govern competition in the developing world. So basically, the idea was that whoever can control these growing economies, they're going to be able to control the future markets. And the Soviet Union and the U.S. couldn't come up with a gentleman's agreement to say, okay, we weren't going to go to war about this, because they did. There was a whole Iran-Contra affair. There was like all these small areas. Even now, the U.S. and the Soviets, like if you see like India right now is considered one of the growing economies of the world, or Brazil. Those leaders are having a lot of meetings with both Putin and the United States to try to, because each side's trying to woo one over to the other. So that wasn't great. And then Jimmy Carter, my boy Jimmy Carter, what a god. He changed the emphasis of American policy of management Cold War to the promotion of human rights. So this guy was like, yo, we're fighting for too long. Nixon was like really violent. We're seeing like a ton of stuff. Let's just be human. So he wanted to like end our working with dictators. He wanted to like remove the Shah of Iran. So we all know the revolution that happened in 1979. There was the whole thing of like the I'm not gonna go into it. That's like a really complicated. Basically, just watch the movie Argo. If you have any questions, let me know. The end of the Cold War. So that what happened is President Ronald Reagan basically replaced Carter in 1981. And he basically said, "Oh, we're going to like restore American credibility, or whatever, like make America great again." Like, I'm not even kidding. Like, I talked to a people at the government. He's like, literally, Reagan was the Donald Trump of that time. It's like hella funny. Basically, it's like he's gonna like do a massive like anti-communist regime. This is already when the communist like regime is kind of like already coming to a hell of a standstill. So it's kind of like stupid. But like, you know, we have the whole Iran-Contra affair, like bloc communism in like Nicaragua. We have the whole idea of we're fighting the war in Afghanistan, because in 1979 they were invaded, and God, so much such good stuff to go in here. Like, there's a whole thing about the Mujahideen, how Al Qaeda came to be in Afghanistan, but I'm not going to get into that. So then Gorbachev started like getting into agreements with the United States. He kind of started to decrease the power of the Soviet Union, which then led to, you know, perestroika and the Mostroika and like all the other reforms that made democratic rule and capitalism like possible in the Soviet Union. Of course, as we know, capitalism is driven by human greed, and humans have tons of it. So capitalism wins, and basically the Soviet Union came to an end. So then we were going after the post-Cold War. So the Soviet Union fell in 1991. That was when Russia came into existence, the Russian Federation, as we know it today. So after that, we have a couple wars. We have, in 1990s, we have Operation Desert Storm, which is when Iraq. So this is under not Saddam Hussein. Was it under Saddam Hussein? I'm forgetting. Someone. Basically, Iraq tried to like, invade Kuwait, which is like their neighbor to the west, I think, because Kuwait has like massive oil reserves. And that was like a idea like, oh, they're like, you know, taking international action. So basically the UN Security Council powers, so like that's not okay. You want to punch Iraq. And that I think is a war that was low-key justified, kind of in a sense, that it was preventing the destruction of Iraq itself, of Kuwait, which is a nation recognized by the United Nations. That was a success. We drove Hussein back. But there was one key thing that Bush's father did that he didn't do. President George Bush, the first one, he understood that removing Saddam Hussein from power would become dangerous, because he easily could have. The U.S. forces were incredibly powerful at this point in time. We were the best military in the world, and we drove them back to Iraq. But he didn't invade Iraq. He said, "We're gonna drive you out of Kuwait. You ain't gonna get our oil. You ain't gonna get Kuwaiti resources, but you're not gonna invade Iraq," because he knew that would lack an exit strategy. However, 9/11 happened. 9/11 happened, of course, because Al Qaeda decided to bomb the Twin Towers on September 11th, 2001, which then led to a massive spark of nationalism throughout the entire United States, demanding for Al Qaeda's blood. The government basically took this as an option with Rumsfeld and Cheney and all the wonderful people at the Bush White House, and they took it as an opportunity to basically push a massive military campaign. So in 2002, 2003, we did the huge invasion into Iraq. And I know I skipped the Clinton here. I'm just going to go through Iraq first, and then we're going to get through other stuff. So we had the invasion of Iraq, Iraqi freedom, and that basically we went all the way into Iraq because we believed that Iraq was holding Al Qaeda. Of course, it was proven false later on. He went to Afghanistan and Pakistan, where Obama later found him and killed him. But we went to Iraq over whatever it was. We said that there were WMDs, Al Qaeda was there, whatever. But we wanted oil and we wanted the resources. So we took out Saddam Hussein, but Saddam Hussein was dictator, but he was a majority dictator, and we didn't want to put someone from his party, from his background. He was a Sunni. Majority of Iraq is Sunni, Muslim, and we put a Shia government in power, which was very oppressive to the Sunnis, and that created ISIS. So yeah, we'll get to that. Bill Clinton then. Yeah, so Bill Clinton, after Bush, he had one of the greatest periods of economic benefit in the history of the United States. And he basically wanted to improve democracy. He basically created all these agreements like NAFTA, which is a North American Free Trade Agreement. You'll hear about that a lot in politics. Basically, it was like a way to improve trading between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. It brought in a lot of issues with jobs and removed a lot of U.S. industry, which you can debate. It also led to the World Trade Organization under the United Nations, which replaced GATT. There was a whole issue of China joining the World Trade Organization, which was dangerous. Some may believe. He also worked to bring together the European Union and making sure that Soviet allies previously, after the fall of the Soviet Union, such as Poland, for example, were able to then join the European Union and make sure that they were still part of Europe to kind of quantify that. So he was kind of let's make democracy great again, which is not really the most possible situation, but it was okay. And then, of course, we wanted to do ethnic conflicts. So in Somalia, there was now Somalia is an absolute mess of a nation. Yugoslavia, there was a situation where the EU first came to actual situations where after the breakup of Yugoslavia, the EU took drastic actions and carried out bombing attacks to kind of like prevent the abuse of people. Um, yeah, you can read all about that. So there was quite a few stuff there. And then, of course, we get in 9/11, the war in Afghanistan, the war on terror. It also became like kind of almost like this idea of like America first, like not really wanting to support and like international sovereignty. So they withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol, which was like asking for decreasing emissions for global warming. They decreased from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which is basically saying don't build freaking anti-ballistic missiles, because that only prompts more militarization, and anti-ballistic missiles are not really that powerful. But that was taken away at the International Criminal Court. Like, talk about it if you want to do it. ICJ and ICC is low-key pretty complicated. And then we had the whole issue like the global war on terrorism. We had like the Afghanistan situation where like we told the Taliban to like leave Afghanistan. And that didn't go well. The Taliban's still around. We supported like a ton of stuff in the Northern Alliance. We fought Al Qaeda. Nothing really got done. So we went to Iraq because we thought that okay, Iraq has WMDs. They created like the axis of evil: Iraq, North Korea, and Iran. So then, we fought there, but then Iraq did not really go as we planned, and then we saw ISIS occur. And recently, we pulled out of Iraq, but now the President Obama has gone back into Iraq. They actually are fighting in Mosul and Fallujah to keep cities in Syria, in Iraq, and Syria. My guess, if I was to make one, would be that the U.S. is going to stay involved in the Syrian conflict. Okay. It's taking forever. Okay. Foreign policy decision making. How does it work? So the Constitution was basically that the president has control over the Department of Defense and the government, but then the Senate also must give advice. That's like the basic idea, right? In order for any war to be called, Congress must declare war. The president said here only 5 wars have been called. Great. But the fact is that presidents have overarching executive power. That was like the Gov resolutions and gave them, and like other resolutions that later gave them, like war powers resolution. Even though like restricted their power, it still gave them a little bit of it, a power. So we can still send like troops overseas. Like for example, like we all like watch the shows on like Madam Secretary like West Wing or whatever. Where like like a terrorist, we have to go kill the terrorists. We take a drone, we shoot them out of the sky, we shoot them on the ground. Boom. That's U.S. military forces being quoted abroad, but that doesn't require Congress approval. Generally, like, the Gang of Eight will be told if like, there's a massive national security situation going on, like the chairs of the Defense Committee. You don't know what the Gang of Eight are. But generally, Congress is not always looked into it. Yeah. The executive branch is basically where all foreign policy is created. The Senate has very little control over it. They simply advise. The U.S. foreign relations is simply for giving money to the budget, but that's not really much else. Department of State, as we know, deal with diplomacy. They don't pick up weapons. They have diplomats. They have embassies. They create negotiations. You have the NSC, which are really cool group of people. They are the National Security Council, who are the president's top advisors, personal advisors on national security matters. You have the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I've actually met the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's a very, very cool guy, General Joseph Dumford of the Marines. Very cool people. Basically, they're called the service chiefs of the U.S. military. So for the Marines, for the Air Force, for the Army, I don't think the Coast Guard has one. The Marine has a commander, and the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy, they all have a service chief. And then alongside the Assistant Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs is the primary military advisor to the President of the United States. And on top of that, so they also are the highest ranking military official in the United States. They are as close as we can get to a 5-star general. They're technically all 4-star generals. We haven't had a 5-star general in a long time. But, yeah. Let's go through here. CIA. Doesn't need explanation. It's the CIA. Top-notch secret operatives. Barely know what the hell they do, but they do stuff that keeps it safe. Department of Homeland Security. That's like a lot of stuff. They run the border patrol. ICE, as we know, Immigration and Customs Citizenship Enforcement. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They run counterterrorism projects. They run cybersecurity. So there's a lot that happens there as well. So yeah, you can go through this. The president, blah blah blah. Department of State, Department of Justice, the TSA, Federal Emergency Management Agency. The FEMA is like the U.S. version of USAID. USAID is from our international agency, which is under the State Department. The intelligence community. There's always the CIA. Also, fun fact, there are actually 16, yes, that's right, 16 civilian defense, civilian intelligence agencies. Most of them are under the military, under the umbrella of the Director of National Intelligence. There's the CIA, FBI counts as that. There's the DAI, or DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency. There's like the Marines have one, the Air Force have one, nuclear people have one, energy has one. And they're all under the Department of National Intelligence, Director of National Intelligence. So I think was James Clapper until he resigned recently, and now Trump put someone else. I don't really remember. Congress, like I said, they have some level of control. They're able to pass acts, like the Patriot Act, which was massive spying on U.S. citizens, basically to prevent terrorism attacks. They can have some level of enforcement. They can do hearings, but they really can't do that much. The biggest thing they can do is they can affirm treaties. For example, the situation right now with TPP, which is a Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which is right now considering this is not going to get ratified by the U.S. Senate, which means that U.S. will not be part of the TPP, which is a trade deal between us and our neighbors. Or not our neighbors, us and Asia. So that's like a place where they can have quite a bit of influence, because if we can't get into a treaty, can't really do much. They can also approve the department chairs, right? The secretaries. So now the question's like, General Mattis, Mad Dog Mattis, who's the primed to be Department of Secretary of Defense, he needs a congressional waiver to actually be Secretary of Defense, because there's a 7-year requirement for him to be retired. And appointments, they can appropriate things. We learned about weapon resolution. I won't go into it. The judiciary basically zero power. It can restrict prior restraint and executive privilege. Those are some options where the Pentagon Papers, but they don't have much control when it comes to they're more like the human rights stuff. If people are being misused, for example with Guantanamo. But yeah, that's pretty much as far as it goes. And then interest groups. We all know President Dwight Eisenhower, at the end of his farewell address, he talked about the military-industrial complex that was going to be dangerous. We have organizations such as Lockheed Martin, Boeing. There are tons of them. Northrop Grumman, General Aeronautics. Basically, all military defense companies that need contracts, so they pressure for more military action. Occasionally, when we maybe not needed, that's the State Department to balance them out. We have actors that are for peace. For example, we have the groups I'm part of that advocate for peaceful solutions. There's the Carter Center, which advocates for peaceful solutions to conflict that we may think need positivity. The UN is a huge interest group. They actually have a massive amount of lobbying that they do to the U.S. government to make sure the U.S. government doesn't take excessive steps and what we don't think is important. Think tanks are huge. Pretty much the entire foreign policy of the Iraq War, in terms of its propaganda establishment, was done by AEI, American Enterprise Institute. There are also top levels from universities. For example, SAIS, the School of Advanced International Studies, which is John Hopkins' graduate school for international relations. It's number 1 in the nation. Their top professors were people invited to the White House to serve as political appointees for the Iraq War. So they have quite a amount of power. There's also the APAC, American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which is Israel's our number 1 political issue right now. It used to be other stuff in foreign policy like Russia, but now it's Israel. Every single issue in international relations has to deal with Israel because they have such an important role in the way our country works. Greenpeace, I guess, they can enforce foreign policy, for example, Sea Shepherd. If they go on board a Japanese vessel, then the State Department to go there and be sorry, Japan, this won't happen again, yada yada yada. I want to let you guys read into the trade stuff. Basically, the way trade works, it must be mutually beneficial. There has to be a strategic trade policy, so you're not losing more than you're gaining. We basically had trade with China, but WTO was a bit of an issue because people didn't want to join the WTO. They felt they had too much power, labor laws, Al Qaeda, arms proliferation. So you can guess what that could be about. Case for North Korea. You can read about that. Okay, final one. New reforms. New challenges in American foreign policy. So, this is the fun part where I get to talk to you guys about what's happening. So the number one thing that right now is happening, we're seeing a massive growth of other economies. There's something called the BRIC countries. It's Brazil, Russia. Russia is weird because it's kind of already an existing economy, but Russia's back on the upbring. But actually, right now, Putin's promised to suicide his entire economy for the sake of his foreign policy objectives. So that may not be a situation so far, but it's still powerful. India and China um, are big, and then there's also South Africa that's sometimes involved, so like BRICS. So basically, these nations are very growing powers. For example, we're seeing with Modi, Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India. He is taking incredible globalization efforts. He met with global leaders. He's working on like development projects in India with both the U.S. and Russia. Brazil, it's had a lot of scandals so recently about the Iraq War. Not about the Iraq War, about its gas situation, but it's still a very powerful nation. As you see, they host the entire Olympics. Pretty good. So these are powers like basically the U.S. and Russia both want to get influence in, and it's going to be interesting how that evolves and how we try to use our soft power in the region. Like I think Brazil is high chance of it going towards us, but we never know right now. It's the way the current world's going. Like I said, it's very, very, very crisis. China, China is like I could spend 5 hours talking about China. China is, I guess, what you'd get closest to like an amalgam in our foreign policy. Nobody knows what's going on with China. Nobody knows how it's thinking. Nobody knows what it's doing. It's a very interesting case study right now. We have the issue of the South China Sea, we have the issue of Macau, we have the issue of Hong Kong, we have the issue of North Korea, we have the issue of Tibet. There's China's like randomly investing in like Africa. It's very, very active right now. It's building like helicopter carriers. China's very, very active. India has massive economic growth. It's still a developing country. It's not at all at the level of the United States, for example, but it is developing more military strength. For example, India recently revealed the USS Chennai, which is like a stealth class destroyer, which is fairly powerful. There have like also India is one of the countries that has not a party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty of the United Nations for nuclear weapons, which means that they have nuclear weapons. We've pretty much all but confirmed them. So is Pakistan, Israel, and some other nations like North Korea. So that makes them also exceptionally dangerous. Europe's getting really weird. We just had the Greek exit crisis happen, where like we thought Greece was going to exit the European Union. They're having a bunch of problems with the euro. The euro is not a very stable currency right now. It's one thing that happens when you get so much fiscal policy intertwined, because the euro doesn't send its own fiscal policy. The nations do, and its own monetary policy. It's like gets very confusing. Euro, I feel like Europe's situation is though. The euro will always be an issue, and like the question though, right now Europe facing I guess the best way to say it is the way that a person I met said it. He is the White House bureau chief for the Der Spiegel, which is like the biggest German newspaper. He said that Europe right now is facing a crisis of identity. What does Europe want to be? For example, we're seeing right now where there's like massive amounts of like populist fervor that's growing. It's like in Italy, far right movements are increasing. In Greece, we saw the Golden Dawn that was increasing. Germany, we're seeing neo-Nazi parties that are increasing. UK just decided to leave the Europe. The basically just did Brexit from the European Union, and that's a huge far right move. And we're seeing the Conservative Party try to deal with that. We're seeing a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment for some like areas like Hungary. So Europe's facing a very interesting crisis of identity right now. It's important to see where Europe goes with this. Will Europe fall to Russia? Probably not, but you never know. Europe's also having this situation where like Turkey's trying to like join Europe, and an interesting idea is that since the European Parliament is based on population of a nation, if Turkey actually joins the European Parliament, which is the body of the EU, the main body of the EU, it'll actually become the number one largest represented group in the European Parliament, which would be a massive upset of European policy. So that's Europe's interesting. And then, of course, we have the Middle East. We have constant actions taking place there. We have military threats. There's ISIS. We have conflicts with Syria. Iran is on its way of developing a nuclear weapon, which is always dangerous. Saudi Arabia has human rights abuses. South America is okay, but we also have communist regimes there. For example, Fidel Castro passed away, so we have to see how Raul Castro will be in Cuba. So foreign policy is an incredible field. I say anybody who wants to get involved in foreign policy, absolutely do. Just make sure you know what you're getting involved into, because it's a very dangerous and hard field. I hope this is a good introduction to foreign policy. If you want to talk to me about foreign policy, feel free to come to MUN meetings every Monday. Or not every Monday, what am I saying? Yeah, every Monday at lunch in Mr. Suda's room. We talk about foreign policy there. But yeah, foreign policy. I feel government, this class, like, gave like an okay example of how foreign policy works, but it's very complicated. The world order is much more different than we look at it. I think the number one thing to do in foreign policy is don't read cable news. Read journals. If you want to know actually how the world works, you have to read the people who are actually working on the world. Also, you need to meet with the people who are working in the world, because they know things that we don't. Because a lot of information is classified, state secrets. So yeah, read like foreign affairs, foreign policy is one of my favorites. The Diplomat, which talks about Asian issues. The Economist is pretty good. They have some guest speakers. Get involved in an organization. I work with something called the World Affairs Council. That basically was created by people of the United Nations to increase education of international relations. Talking if you want to get involved in that. Foreign policy is a really interesting field. It requires a lot of effort. It requires a lot of research since it's much broader than the rest of the United States. It's very adaptive. It's very crazy. It's what I call nuclear chess squared to the millionth, hundredth time. Like, the world doesn't stop changing, but we try what we can to make the world a better place, to kind of create a sense of global legitimacy. The world is going to move forward without us or not, and it's important for the United States and its allies to adapt in the way that it sees best fit to move forward. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this lecture on foreign policy. This is really long. I'm going to cut it down. Okay, bye.